the slides you're sharing, and recording is started. So take it away.
Okay, so there are just a bunch of little event timing updates. I wasn't even sure if it would fill the time slot, but there are a bunch of issues filed that aren't getting all that much attention. So I thought I'd do a rapid fire walkthrough. So if anybody does have feedback and wasn't aware of the conversation, that will be your prompt. And given the previous conversation, maybe there is more to discuss. So some of the topics revolve around the concept of interaction. So I thought I'd start with just a quick review so we all have the context. So, event timing reports on the timing of individual events. So why did we need to add an interactions concept? It's because there are actually a variable number of events which fire with each discrete input. They can have different timestamps, different render times, meaning they can appear in different animation frames. And there isn't always a simple mapping of like, these events always map to these interactions. It's context dependent. Not all pointer events turn into interactions because they could become scroll, they could become canceled. Not all input actually comes from keyboard sources, et cetera, et cetera. So what we wanted was to basically represent the way users think of interacting with a page. I tapped 3 times and I clicked on my keyboard 2 times. I should have 5 interactions. And just to simplify grouping. So like I said, yeah, but event timing only reports on events. And so as we looked, we realized that there's a lot of overlapping events in time because they sort of get dispatched in one after the other. You have this originating input, which has a hardware timestamp. You dispatch a whole bunch of events for it, and then all of them update the DOM or UI or however, and then appear in the next pane. So if all you care about is counting interactions and knowing the total duration of interactions, it suffices to sort of take the first event, handpick some important ones, and label them accordingly. And that's what we do. We expose an interaction ID to event timing, at least in Chromium these days. And this is sufficient to sort of highlight those important events. It's sufficient to group different events by interaction across animation frames. It's sufficient to measure INP. But when you want to dig deeper, and this is where we've gotten a lot of developer feedback, a lot of developer confusion, it isn't always sufficient. Things get messier. So every event, every task on main thread, everything that keeps the page busy plays a role in delaying responsiveness. I think to the context of the previous conversation, multiple rage clicks with the page could affect the overall responsiveness of the page. And the types of events that fire depend on the target of the event. They depend on the state of the page. And it begins to make you wonder what really is part of an interaction. Let me just give you one quick example to sort of preview what we'll talk about. On mobile, you can't actually hover over elements like you would on desktop with a mouse. And the moment you click on an element, we will start by firing hover events. So hover is not a discrete interaction, but it will always fire right before like a pointer or click event. And so it will always come first and it will always delay. And it's very common on many rich sites who try to add very nice animations. It takes a long time to get an animation going, and that always delays like the interaction. So was that part of the interaction? Not strictly by our definition, but if you look at traces, it is obvious that that's the source of many performance issues. So, what would help developers given how much confusion we have here? Right now we're labeling, this pointer down was a slow interaction, but it might have played a very small role. Like that specific event might actually have played a small role. It just helped you find a time range that was interesting. We considered expanding how many events we expose interaction ID on. Maybe every event we think is part of the interaction gets an interaction ID, but there are actually a lot and it can differ. And there could be situations like rage clicks where there are multiple interactions in flight and it's hard to know what caused what. So there isn't a simple mapping. We're not always going to get this right. Another option is just to treat everything as part of an interaction. But again, there could be multiple weird overlaps. So this is an open-ended conversation, but there's a lot of effort in this space, especially on the tooling front, documentation front, and we get lots of developer confusion here. So that's just an FYI. Here's another picture of what this looks like. 3 different pages, different elements I interacted with on mobile and desktop, and you could see the types of events that will fire. And I tried to keep it as stable as possible. So I just did one single simple interaction, and you still get a whole bunch of different events. And here's another example where one of these is an interaction, the other one is not an interaction. And you'd be hard pressed to figure that out with just a count of events or just by tracking events. You really need to, the browser's doing a lot to sort of track it to the best of its ability, the right context to expose for you interaction IDs. So that's just a quick reminder. We have had questions also about event timing, the performance timeline buffering and interaction. So right now, events only report when they exceed the duration threshold of 104 milliseconds by default. If you register your own performance observer, you can override that down to 16 milliseconds. The problem is that buffering, the default buffer from initial page load, will always be 104 milliseconds. You cannot override that in any way. So we often get confusing feedback. It happens to me on a regular basis where I will drop a snippet on a page that has already been around for a while. It's already been loaded. And I will expect to get my list of events, and I will see none, even though I interacted, even though I knew something happened. And the reason is I've asked for a duration threshold of 16, but you can't apply that retroactively. So we have this issue file to try and think about options here. One option is to decrease that default duration threshold, but then it applies to all events. Another option is to sort of exempt interactions, but that flies in the face of the previous suggestion, which is what actually is an interaction. So there's a conversation going on here. And some experiments that we're planning to do in Chromium to at least measure the size of the effects, FYI. Another thing we've talked about before about exposing interaction counts, and we decided to simplify that into interaction count. I think we've talked about that as a group. This was recently added to Chromium, and that's related to this problem with buffering and event counting and exposing. If you really want to measure the number of interactions, which is one of the inputs to the algorithm for IMP, this API makes that easier, and it's recently been added, so FYI. All right, so those were topics on interactions that are currently in flight. And maybe we should talk about Dan's question on hydration and measurement afterwards. Another topic is first input delay versus interactions. So event timing exposes both first input and events. The major difference is that first input is always exposed regardless of the time it takes, so regardless of duration. So duration threshold is never applied there, which is really good. It's really good to be informed of the first interaction, especially. And even though we don't like input delay of the first input, measuring the first input is very valuable. The actual criteria in the spec of when to measure what constitutes a first input versus what constitutes an interaction have diverged. They're different. The first input criteria is much simpler. It sufficed for a long time, and it informed how we came up with the concept of interactions. But now you can get situations where first input is not reported, even though you have events which are labeled interactions. You can also have interactions or vice versa. And this can be confusing. It also makes the spec more complicated. So there's a bunch of open issues and questions around, can we sort of redefine first input delay to just be the delay of the first interaction? It seems to make sense to me. All right, events and render time. So our Paint APIs expose a render time property, or at least element timing does on Chromium. And the render time property is meant to be the most approximate presentation time of an animation frame that has these interesting paints. The way it's actually exposed, though, is all of these entries expose it as the start time. They will have a render time if the element passes timing allow origin. And these entries always have a duration of 0. They're always relative to the time origin of the navigation. Now, event timing doesn't actually expose render time, but it does have a similar concept. That's because the duration value of events is sort of exposed in terms of the render time that the event had. So you take the render time, you subtract its timestamp, and you get a duration. Okay. And it's common advice that you see in blogs and in tooling and in snippets that if you want to know when an event ends, you just take its start time and add its duration. The problem is that we round duration to 8 milliseconds. We don't round the timestamp. The timestamp is the hardware accurate timestamp that you would get if you registered an event handler, but you do round the duration, which is defined in terms of render time. So what this means is it just creates weird behaviors. That duration could get rounded up, it could get rounded down. There could be different events with different start times. So some events get rounded up, some events get rounded down. If you do have LCP entries or other paint timing entries, they don't have the same behavior. So you just get different things ending at different times. It makes it really difficult to group. It becomes impossible actually at higher refresh rate monitors because you don't actually know if you're bleeding across animation frames. And it's also just an inconsistency between the way these things are exposed. So here's a screenshot that tries to showcase what I'm talking about in case it's too confusing. At the top is what I measured using Performance Observer. On the bottom is what Chrome exposes through tracing. So if you actually recorded a profile of a page, you'll get the accurate times, and all events end on in the exact same spot, so they nicely line up. Whereas if you measure performance timeline, they all sort of stagger like a waterfall. And it's even weird that this last event ended before the previous one. Like, it's just impossible. Like that could not have been possible. But it's not too bad if you do a bunch of clever math to try and group these as best you can, but it isn't so easy. Like, you can't just throw them in a map and by time. So we've had some feedback about that. So there's this issue, which is proposing we could consistency by actually exposing render time. If we chose to do that, it would be a good opportunity to also fix the previous issue. We could, if we still feel it's important for event timing to round off this property, which we don't do for other paint timings, we could just round it off at the render time property. And so of all event timings that appear together in the same frame would have the same value, and it would make you group by frame very easily. So hopefully all of that makes sense. There are also several issues to do with what is the right rendering timestamp. So perhaps related to Dan's question as well, where if the event wasn't registered yet, will it have a next paint? A lot of developers had confusion about this. What exactly will INP measure? There are, of course, times where an event happens, an interaction happens, nothing actually changes. There will not be a next paint. Rendering will not be queued. There's no rendering opportunity. And so we actually fall back to measuring a lesser time, but the spec is not really clear on when that happens. So there's just some simple simple requests to change that. But there are also times where there are kind of ambiguity as to what really is the next paint. So as an example, I recently patched a visibility change. So if you click a link that opens a new tab because it has target blank, you'll automatically get a visibility change, perhaps before the page is able to render. That's fine. The user is not waiting for that next paint opportunity, but technically we didn't actually, there was a next paint requested, it didn't get there. And so we used to expose the time when the tab switched back to visible, which doesn't make sense. It would be an arbitrary long time that the tab was in the background. So changes like that. There's also the case of page unload, which we just talked about, rage clicks that lead to reloading or unloading. Those don't get reported. In those cases, you might never have gotten next paint, but we think we should still count the duration that was delayed. Perhaps unload itself was delayed, etc. Or maybe the user unloaded because of the long responsiveness issue. So those are still important to record. So we'll clear those up. And finally, another one is history API usage. I think I'll talk a bit more about that in a sec. So yeah, there might be changes where we don't always want to measure technically until the next paint. All right. And then finally, we've had requests to add more support for exposing different event types. Some of these seem probably like just oversights. There are different types of focus events. We report some of them, but not all of them. Forms have different events. We report on input type, like submit, change, or rather change and input, but we don't report form, submit, or reset. And these are discrete events typically triggered by interactions with the web content. So we could still filter on trusted discrete inputs. There are also other types of discrete events. that aren't technically with web contents, like pressing the back button in your browser will fire history API events. You didn't really interact with the web contents itself, but it was like a discrete user interaction. And it could have been, like there could have been a back button on the page. So there isn't much conceptually different. And so that should be measured. Same with the drag and drop API, very similar. So we might be doing an audit of those. And so if anybody, we've gotten some feedback. Microsoft recently filed some requests to add a few of these. But if anybody is measuring event timing right now and missing things that you think should be there, let us know. And I think with that, that's it for the presentation.
Cool. So let me stop the recording.